One colony fell. Then humanity sent 700,000 warships for vengeance. The vote was 714 to 88. The Accord called it a referral. The Record called it reviewable. Nobody called it what it was. Consul Drethvi of the Vrethkai stood at the floor lectern and read the notification in the flat, careful voice his people used for verdicts they did not make. His jaw clicked once, the faint bilateral grind that meant he was choosing every word with precision. The chamber smelled of burning resin and recycled air, the blended atmosphere of 41 species compressed into something that had no name but always tasted faintly of old decisions. Above them, through 58 meters of clear alloy, the stars burned cold and said nothing. The Keth Dominion, Drethvi read, filed territorial clarification notification 741 on the fourth day of the current session. The territory in question designated Callaway's Rest, a human-registered colony in Rim Corridor 7, has been reclassified as administered space under the Keth Dominion Border Operations Directorate. Casualties are recorded as an administrative outcome of the clarification action. The Accord's review body recommends referral to tribunal for formal assessment. Estimated tribunal timeline, 9 to 11 years. He stopped reading. He set the document down. He did not look at row 7. In the seats behind him, 912 representatives of the oldest deliberative body in the known galaxy sat with the vote they had just cast and did not speak. 41,000 dead, filed as an administrative outcome. The resin elder Ashadi burned during session smelled like cedar soaked in old copper. She was the oldest realloy in the chamber, 880 years of watching the Accord process things, and her throat markings had gone dark the moment Drethvi began reading. She had requested the floor. She had been given 3 minutes. "I have watched this body use the word quiet twice before," she said from her seat in the elder tier. "I have watched it use the word patience twice before. Both times the species the Accord described as quiet turned out to be doing something else entirely. I am not able to tell you what humanity is doing. I am telling you that the word quiet is the wrong word. I have been wrong before. I am telling you I do not think I am wrong now." Nobody asked her to elaborate. The vote had already been cast. 714 to 88, referral to tribunal, 9 to 11 years. The beacon on Callaway's Rest had been deactivated, not destroyed in the engagement, not damaged by the approach, deactivated from inside before the first Keth ship crossed the boundary marker. The Accord's formal record noted this as consistent with non-military outpost operational status. It was the most expensive misread in 11,000 years of institutional history. Nobody knew that yet. Stay close. What came next had been running for 60 years before anyone in that chamber learned to say the colony's name. 6 weeks before the vote, Veth Droon had read the colony specifications for Callaway's Rest in approximately 4 minutes. He was supreme executor of the Keth Dominion's Border Operations Directorate, which meant he had read colony specifications for 11 territories before this one. He read them the same way every time: garrison status, defense grid rating, communication infrastructure, beacon operational status. The answers told him what he needed to know. Callaway's Rest had no garrison. It had no defense grid. Its communication beacon had been listed as deactivated for routine maintenance on the last 3 inspection cycles. A schedule consistent with a colony that prioritized agricultural output over security infrastructure. Client-tier species, Droon noted, in the shorthand he used for species he had already categorized. Prioritized sentiment over defense. Regrettable but predictable. He filed the read. He moved to the next territory on the proposal list. His office aboard Iron Verdict occupied the full forward section of the command deck, a space designed to communicate, through sheer scale, that the person working in it had never needed to move quickly. Droon moved through it with the deliberate economy of something that had been building expansion plans longer than most species had been filing membership applications. The copper-banded markings on his forearms recorded 11 acquisitions. Calloway's rest would be the 12th. He sent the clarification notification to the Accord through the proper channels, filed on the proper form, in the proper format. He had been doing this for 31 years. Every notification he had ever filed had been processed without consequence. The Accord's procedural frameworks had been designed, over 11,000 years, to process exactly this kind of event. The framework did not disappoint him. The anteroom off the main floor of the Vithara concourse was 3 meters wide and smelled of the same recycled air as the chamber, but quieter, the kind of quiet that comes from two people deciding not to use words they both know. Marin Vale was 58 years old. Her hair had gone gray at the temples sometime in her 44th year, and she had not done anything about it, because she had been in the middle of a negotiation and had not had time, and then the negotiation had ended, and she had simply not thought about it again. She had a coffee from the concourse's service station, the kind that came in a small, sealed container and tasted mostly of the container, and she had not drunk any of it. Consul Drethevai came to find her after the session closed. His skin had the hammered bronze tone of the Vrethkai elder tier, and his jaw clicked once when he said her name, which was the sound he made when he had something to tell someone that his office required him to tell them, and his conscience required him to regret. "The referral stands," he said, 9 to 11 years. "I know," Vale said. "The tribunal track is the only procedural avenue currently." "I know," she said again. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the coffee container. He offered to have tea brought. She said she had coffee. He nodded. She thanked him. The exchange lasted 8 seconds and contained more honest acknowledgement of the situation than anything said on the floor. Drethevai left. Vale sat with the coffee for another moment. Then she walked to the small utility sink in the corner of the anteroom and poured the rest of it down the drain. She watched it go. She dried her hands on the supply towel beside the sink, folded it back the way she had found it, and reached into her left breast pocket. The envelope had been there for 11 years. The flap was worn smooth from the same thumb running across it, not anxiously, not compulsively, just the way you touch something you have decided to carry without opening. Nobody had ever asked her what was inside. She did not open it now. She put it back. She left the anteroom. She went to the human delegation's temporary quarters, which were on the 7th ring, which was where row 7 delegations were housed, which was a piece of architectural honesty the concourse's designers had probably not intended. She sat down at the communication terminal. She typed one word. She sent it to Stonewell Basin. Commander Idris Akafar had been at his desk in the Stonewell Basin installation for 4 hours when the message arrived, which meant he had been at his desk for 4 hours in a room that was 4 meters wide and 9 meters long, and had no windows and no decoration, and a single tactical display that was currently showing the outer rim sensor grid in a state of complete operational normalcy. He was 43 years old. He had held Shepard Activation Authority for 6 years. In 6 years, he had filed the authorization codes every 90 days without exception, in the way that you maintain a thing you hope you will never need to use. He spoke slowly, because he had learned early that people listen harder to slow voices, and he had spent 6 years in a room with no one to speak to except the authorization terminal, so the habit had not been tested much. The message from Vale contained one word. He read it. He sat with it for a moment, not from uncertainty, but from the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting for something for a long time and is being careful with the first second of it arriving. Then he opened the Shepard operational panel for the first time outside a drill. His hands were completely steady. 3 days after the vote, Petty Officer Tomas Sira was at her station aboard EDS Relentless, docked at Node 11 in Rim Corridor 7, doing the kind of work that existed between deployments. Maintenance logs, calibration checks, the slow administrative machinery of a warship with nowhere to be yet. She was 27 years old. She had been born on Callaway's Rest. She had lost 17 people she knew when the Keth Dominion filed its clarification notification, which was the Accord's way of describing what had happened, and she had been doing her job for 72 hours since learning about it because that was the only thing she knew how to do with the weight of it. She had not cried. She had not reported to medical. She had shown up to her station and done her work, because the work was still there, and she was still the person whose job it was. On the third day, she pulled the Callaway's Rest maintenance archive. She could not have said why. A hunch was not the right word. It was more like a question she had not finished asking herself, something about the beacon that had been deactivated before the ships came, the timing of it, the fact of it, the way it sat in the record as a routine maintenance item instead of a last transmission. She opened the log. She read it once. She read it again. She sat with it for 11 hours. Then she sent the log file to Commander HFY with a single line of text. "I think I know what it was for." HFY read the log Sierra sent him in full, twice, then set it aside and did not send a reply. He did not need to. He already knew what the beacon was for. He had known since the day he first opened the Shepard operational files and found Node 14's activation protocol listed under a heading that said, plainly, in the kind of language that meant someone had decided to be very clear about something, colony side trigger, deactivation on approach, passive confirm only, no transmission required. The beacon going quiet was not a malfunction, it was a receipt. He pulled up the Node 14 status feed. Active. Had been active for 96 hours. He pulled up Node 11. Active. Node 3, Node 7, Node 19. All active. He pulled up the master status board and looked at it for a long moment. All 23 indicators green, the way they had been for the last 4 days while the Accord was busy processing its paperwork. 23 staging complexes. 60 years of placement, one node at a time, seeded into the fold space corridors that a rational military planner would use if they had designed a response grid from scratch. Humanity had, before Droon had sent his first notification, before the Keth had classified a single human colony as administered space, before the Accord had finished learning how to say Callaway's Rest. HFY reached for the roll. The roll was a physical document, which was unusual for a military installation in the current era, and the reason it was physical was the same reason the authorization codes were rotated every 90 days, and the same reason the room had no windows. Some things were kept off the network on purpose. He read it aloud, quietly, the way you read something you have been carrying for a long time and are finally putting down. 19 fleet staging zones. Node commanders at each, pre-positioned crews, pre-calculated approach vectors, fold space transit already programmed, capital ships, interdiction platforms, support vessels. The list took 4 minutes to read through completely. At the end of each node entry, a crew count, a readiness status, and a 2-word confirmation protocol. He keyed the confirmation circuit. Node 1. Node ready. Node 2. Node ready. He went through all 19. Each response came back in 2 words, flat and certain, from commanders who had been sitting in pre-positioned holds for years in some cases, filing their 90-day checks, running their drills, doing their maintenance rotations, waiting for the 2 words that would tell them their waiting was over. When he reached Node 11, the confirmation came back in the same flat voice as the others. Tomas Sierra was at her station. She had sent the beacon log and then returned to her post and done her job, because that was what her job was, and she was the kind of person who knew the difference between the weight of a thing and the moment to set it down. He did not tell her what the roll said. She already knew, in the way that you know something when you have lived inside the infrastructure of it without being told the whole shape. 700,000 warships, pre-crewed, pre-positioned, No mobilization order needed because the mobilization had happened 60 years ago, a little at a time, in the fold space corridors where no one was inspecting. HFY set the roll down. He thought about the 41,000 people on Calloway's Rest, the way he had been trying not to think about them since the word arrived from Vale, keeping the fact in the peripheral part of his mind where he put things that needed to be felt later, after the work was done. He thought about Tomas Sierra, 27 years old, sitting with a beacon log for 11 hours before she trusted herself to say anything. He thought about the word Vale had sent him. One word, no explanation needed, no demand, no grief in it, or rather the grief was there, but the way it was there in a wall that has been built to hold pressure, not by being absent but by being load-bearing. He authorized the transmission. No preamble, no diplomatic seal, no demands, no accusations, no statement of intent. 11 sets of coordinates, each one a Keth military installation, each one confirmed against the current operational registry and a single number. The message was sent unencrypted, on an open accord channel, logged and time-stamped and publicly accessible to any member with monitoring access, which was all of them. No warning, no declaration, no mercy, just coordinates and a countdown stripped of everything except the information itself, the way a bill of receipt is stripped of everything except what is owed. The Keth Signals officer who received it at Iron Verdict spent 4 minutes searching for the rest of the message. She checked the header. She checked the encryption layer, which showed no encryption layer. She ran the transmission through 3 format validators because the absence of a diplomatic preamble registered as a possible corruption flag. Each validator returned the same result. The file was complete. The message was what it appeared to be. She brought it to Droon. Veth Droon read the transmission once. He had the coordinates confirmed against the installation registry by a separate analyst. He had 4 separate analysts review the timestamp interpretation. What a 72-hour countdown to the precise locations of your own military installations, constituted under existing accord engagement doctrine. None of them agreed. The problem was not the countdown. Countdowns were a known psychological maneuver format: create urgency, induce defensive repositioning, observe the response. The problem was the coordinates. A psychological maneuver used approximate coordinates, or coordinates for civilian centers, or coordinates that implied a threat vector. Using the exact coordinates of your target's own installations implied something else entirely, something the doctrine files did not have a category for, because the category would have required someone to imagine a scenario in which a species with no recorded military infrastructure sent a precise, location-confirmed countdown to the full list of your active staging sites. The Keth Dominion had been classifying humanity as client tier for longer than Droon had been filing notifications. The classification had never been wrong. He filed the transmission as a psychological maneuver. He was a 31-year veteran of border operations. He had seen psychological maneuvers. This fit the profile, unconventional delivery, stripped format, designed to create uncertainty. He noted it in the operations log. He assigned a monitoring detail to watch for follow-up communications. Then he returned to the expansion proposals for the 3 territories after Calloway's Rest. His shoulder ridges were entirely still. At the Vethara concourse, Marin Vale had been sitting in the human delegation's quarters for 11 hours when she heard the confirmation from Stonewell Basin that the transmission had gone out. She was not doing anything in particular during those 11 hours. She had read 3 briefing documents she did not need to read. She had made a second coffee and not drunk it. She had taken the envelope out of her breast pocket once, held it for a moment, and put it back. The quarters were small and beige and smelled of the same recycled air as every other part of the concourse. There was a window, which was more than HFY had, and through it the gas giant cauldron prime filled the lower third of the view, a slow-moving gradient of amber and deep red, lit from below by its own atmospheric chemistry, indifferent to everything happening in orbit above it. She looked at it for a while. She was not calm exactly. She was something that looked like calm from the outside, which was different. She had learned the difference in her 30s when she had been a signals analyst and had spent long hours watching transmissions for the thing that was not quite right, the detail that sat wrong against its background. You could not do that work anxious. You had to be still in the way that a measuring instrument is still, not because nothing was happening, but because anything moving inside you would throw off the reading. She had been doing that for a long time now, longer than the Keth had been filing notifications. The confirmation came through at 2:12 Accord Standard. She read it. She set the terminal screen to dark. She went asleep in the chair because the bed was across the room and she did not feel like crossing it. In 72 hours, the countdown would reach 0. The next morning, Consul Drethevai sent a formal inquiry to the human delegation, requesting clarification on the nature of the transmission logged at 1:39 Accord Standard. The inquiry was polite, procedurally correct, and arrived via the official Accord interdelegation channel. Vale read it at her terminal with a cup of coffee. She was actually drinking this time. She drafted a response. The response said, "The transmission is a public record, filed on open channel and speaks for itself. The human delegation has no further comment at this time." She sent it. Then she went to the concourse's common observation deck, which was open to all delegations, and stood at the rail for a while with her coffee and watched Cauldron Prime turn in the dark below. Its storms older than the Accord, its atmosphere lit from somewhere deep inside it with a light that had no obvious source. The envelope was in her pocket. The flap was smooth under her thumb. 62 years ago, the first Shepherd node had been placed. The person who had placed it, who had written the activation protocol, who had decided that a colony's beacon going dark would be the key, who had understood that patience at civilizational scale was a different thing from patience at human scale. That person had been dead for 20 years. Vale had known her. She did not open the envelope. She finished her coffee and went back inside. 71 hours after the transmission logged, Petty Officer Tomas Sira had been at her station for 71 of the previous 72 hours. She was not tracking the countdown. The countdown was not her job. Her job was the console in front of her, which showed Node 11 sensor net in full operational status, which showed EDS Relentless and the 43 other vessels at this node holding position in the staging hold, which showed fold space transit calculations running on a loop that had been running for so long the numbers felt like wallpaper. She was not thinking about Calloway's Rest. She was not thinking about the house with the red door that her grandmother had built on the eastern agricultural plain, the one with the wind coming off the ridge in the afternoons that smelled like mineral dust and growing things. She was not thinking about the 17 names. She had put them somewhere specific in her mind, a place with a door she was keeping shut, because the door needed to stay shut for the next hour. In 1 hour, the countdown would reach 0. She checked the sensor net. She ran the calibration cycle on the fold space transit array. She did the small, specific tasks that her station required. The tactical display updated with a soft chime. All nodes confirmed ready. She put her hands flat on the console. She waited. The chime sounded again. Not loud, not alarming. The same soft tone the tactical display used for any status update, the same tone Sierra had heard 1,000 times in drills and maintenance cycles and the long administrative hours between. But this time the update it was announcing was not a calibration result or a node confirmation. It was the timestamp reaching 0. Sierra looked at the display. She did not move her hands from the console. Outside the hull of EDS Relentless, in the staging hold at Node 11, Rim Quarter 7, the Fold Space Transit Array had been running its calculations for 60 years. The numbers had not changed. The destination coordinates were the same ones that had been locked in when the node was first seeded, placed by people who had looked at a map of Keth expansion patterns and asked a simple question. If we had to respond, where would we need to be? The answer was here, and there, and at 21 other places simultaneously. The array fired. Sierra felt it as a pressure change, a shift in the hull's resonance that lasted about half a second, the physical signature of fold space displacement, the same feeling you got during any transit. Then the display updated again. Node 11 deployed. She exhaled once slowly through her nose. Then she pulled up the sensor net, checked her station's operational status, and did her job. At Node 2, the Keth Platform Dawnward Authority had been running a standard patrol rotation when the sensor console registered an anomaly at 400 Accord Standard. The duty officer was a Keth named Sevrath, 12 years in Border Patrol, trained to respond to anomalies with the kind of deliberate calm that the Dominion's operational doctrine described as appropriate bearing. She looked at the console. She looked at it again. The number on the screen was not possible for the number of ships that had been at Node 2's coordinates 4 seconds ago, which was 0. She read it aloud. Reading numbers aloud was part of the verification protocol. It was harder to misread something you were hearing yourself say. She read it twice. The second reading did not change the number. She keyed the command channel and reported it in the flat voice of someone who had decided that the appropriate bearing was the only thing she had left to hold on to. At Node 7, the picket commander sent a standard challenge on the military band. No response. The ships held position, every one of them. Engines at minimum thrust, the lowest operational setting above full stop, enough to hold formation, not enough to read as approach. Weapons cold. Not powered down cold, the kind that meant unprepared, but the kind that meant, we have made a decision about what we are doing right now and this is it. The picket commander's targeting system tried to find a gap in the formation large enough to read as accidental. It could not. Formations with accidental gaps were formations assembled quickly, under pressure, by crews who were still figuring out where to be. This formation had been assembled by crews who had been in these exact positions for a long time and knew precisely where they were. He sent a second challenge. No response. He filed the report upward and waited. At Node 11, Tomas Sierra was watching the same thing on the tactical display that the picket commander at Node 7 was watching through his viewport, except she was watching it from inside it. 43 vessels at Node 11, holding. The formation was exact. She could see the other ships on the display, their positions locked to within meters of the calculated coordinates, and the precision of it was not something she had manufactured by thinking about it. It was just the result of crews who had drilled these positions for years and knew them the way you know the layout of a room you sleep in. She thought about the house with the red door. She thought about 17 names, quickly, the way you think about something you are allowing yourself 1 second with before you close the door again. She thought about her grandmother, who had built that house on the eastern agricultural plain 60 years ago, who had been one of the first settlers on Callaway's Rest, and who had also, a thing Sierra had not known until she opened the beacon log 3 days ago, been one of the 17 engineers who had designed the Node 14 activation protocol. The beacon had not been deactivated for maintenance. Her grandmother had put it there on purpose. Sierra had sat with the beacon log for 11 hours before she sent it to Akaffer because she had needed 11 hours to understand what she was reading. Not the technical content. The technical content was clear. What she had needed 11 hours to understand was the shape of it, the deliberateness of it. The fact that her grandmother had built a colony on a rim corridor that the Keth Dominion would eventually want, and had also built a trigger into the ground beneath it, and had gone to her grave 60 years later without ever once mentioning it. She knew, Sierra thought, she knew what the colony was for. Not just a home, not just a settlement, a key. She put her hands back flat on the console. Outside the hull, 700,000 human warships held position in perfect formation at 11 Keth military installations simultaneously, engines at minimum thrust, weapons cold, saying nothing. Veth Droon received the first fleet confirmation report at Iron Verdict at 4:01 Accord Standard. He read it. He received the second at 4:01 and 17 seconds. He read it. The reports came in sequence, one installation at a time, each one formatted identically to every other military sensor report he had received in 31 years of border operations. Installation designation, sensor reading, ship count, formation status, weapons status. The format was familiar. The contents were not. By the sixth report, his expansion proposals were still open on the secondary display. He had not looked at them since the first report arrived. By the 11th report, he had not spoken. His shoulder ridges were entirely still. Not controlled still, the stillness of a commander managing a reaction, just still, in the way that a thing goes still when the category it has been filed under no longer applies, and the mind has not yet produced a new category to replace it. He opened a response channel to the lead contact point in the human transmission. The composition field was blank. He had been writing difficult communications for 31 years. He knew how to phrase a demand. He knew how to phrase a threat. He knew how to phrase a negotiating position, a concession, a counteroffer, an ultimatum. He had written all of them in various combinations, across 11 territorial acquisitions and 400 years of institutional precedent that he carried the way his predecessors had carried it before him. He did not know how to phrase a response to 700,000 ships that had arrived exactly when they said they would, at exactly the coordinates they had specified, and were now holding position with their weapons cold and saying nothing. Because there was no demand. That was the part he could not locate a response to. A demand could be refused, negotiated, countered. A threat could be assessed, reported, responded to through procedure. But 700,000 ships that simply arrived and then waited in perfect formation at your own installations, without firing, without communicating, without asking for anything at all. What did you say to that? He stared at the blank field. Across 12 active Keth staging networks, 700,000 human warships held position and waited with the patience of something that had been waiting for 60 years already and was comfortable with the concept. He sat with the blank field for 4 seconds. Then he closed it. In the Accord's monitoring division, the transmission that Akafar had sent 72 hours ago was logged, time-stamped, and publicly accessible, which meant that every member with monitoring access, which was all of them, had seen it arrive, and had now seen the fleet confirmation reports arriving from Keth installations across the outer rim, and was in the process of understanding what they were looking at. The chamber would not be in session for another 6 hours. Elder Ashadi was already in her seat. She had not slept. The resin she burned during sessions was burning now, in the small holder she kept at her position, and the smell of cedar and old copper was the only thing moving in the empty chamber. Her throat markings were dim. They had been dim since the vote 3 days ago, and she had not bothered to regulate them. She read the reports as they came in. One installation, then another. Ship counts that did not fit any category in the Accord's response doctrine files, because the response doctrine files had been written under the assumption that a species with no recorded military infrastructure could not produce a response of this kind. She had been trying to tell them that assumption was wrong. She had been given 3 minutes. She did not say, "I told you," to the empty chamber, because there was no one to say it to, and because it was not the thing she was feeling. What she was feeling was older than satisfaction and heavier. The specific weight of having watched a thing coming for a long time and being right about it, and finding that being right did not feel the way you expected it to feel when you were watching it arrive. The chamber's ceiling was 58 meters of clear alloy. Through it, the stars burned cold. She read the next report. And then, in the margin of the last confirmation document, she saw something that had not been in any of the earlier reports. A notation, small, not a military designation, not a sensor reading, a filing reference, the kind of internal code that bureaucracies attach to documents to trace their origin, which department, which authorization chain, which member's diplomatic record. The filing reference on the fleet confirmation documents was rooted through the human delegation's formal record. Every step, every decision, logged, time-stamped, publicly accessible. Humanity had filed it. Ashadi set the report down on her knee and sat very still and thought about Marin Vale's face in the anteroom. The face that had not moved when Drethavai delivered the tribunal ruling. The face that had already known something Drethavai did not know he was delivering. She thought about what it meant to carry a thing for 60 years and never once let it show. What is in that envelope? She thought, and the thought surprised her because she had not known she was thinking it until it was already finished. She burned her resin and waited for the chamber to fill. The chamber filled slowly. Representatives arrived in the order their delegations had been notified, which meant the species with the largest monitoring staffs arrived first and the smaller ones came after, and row 7 arrived last, which was also the order in which they had been seated for 3 centuries. The architecture of the Vethara concourse communicated priorities without stating them. It always had. Marin Vale took her seat in row 7. She had slept 4 hours in the chair and eaten something from the delegation's supply unit that she could not have named afterward. Her hair was the same as it always was. The envelope was in her left breast pocket. She had not opened it. Consul Drethavai was at the floor lectern. His jaw was not clicking. His jaw clicked when he was choosing careful words, and right now he was not choosing words at all. He was waiting for the session to be called to order, looking at the document in front of him with the expression of someone who has been asked to read a map of a country that has just changed its borders. The session was called to order. Drethavai cleared his throat and read the morning's formal business, which consisted of a single item. The Keth Dominion has submitted a request for accord mediation, he said, regarding the positioning of armed vessels in proximity to Keth Dominion military installations. The request is filed under the Accord's mutual security provision and requests expedited review. He set the document down. Nobody in the chamber spoke. The silence lasted long enough that it became a different kind of silence, not the silence of people waiting for someone to begin, but the silence of 912 representatives doing the same arithmetic and arriving at the same place. The Keth Dominion, which had filed a territorial clarification notification 4 days ago, was now filing for mediation protection against the response to that notification. The Accord had procedural language for the first thing. It did not have procedural language for the second thing. Elder Ashadi did not request the floor. She had said what she had to say 3 days ago. She had been given 3 minutes and had used them. There was nothing to add now that the thing she had described was sitting in the sensor logs of 11 Keth military installations, and the Accord's own monitoring record, time-stamped and publicly accessible, filed in the same format the Keth had been using to file clarification notifications for 400 years. She burned her resin, cedar and old copper filling the small space around her seat. Across the chamber, she could see Marin Vale in row 7. Vale was looking at the floor in front of her, not at anything in particular. The way you look at the middle distance when you are present in a room and also somewhere else entirely. Somewhere you have been for a long time. Somewhere the room has not caught up to yet. She was very still. Ashadi had spent 880 years watching people try to be still. Most of them moved in small ways, a finger, a shifted weight, a breath held too long. Marin Vale was not still in that way. She was still in the way that a structure is still, not through effort but because the forces acting on it were exactly balanced, had been balanced for a long time, and she had been built for the load. What is in that envelope? Ashadi thought again. And then, for the first time, she thought she knew. The mediation request sat in the Accord's intake queue in the same format as every other formal submission. Date, filing party, requesting provision, summary of grievance, requested remedy. The document was 2 pages. It was procedurally correct. It had been filed with appropriate haste, within 6 hours of the fleet's arrival, and the haste was visible in the way that haste is always visible in very formal documents. The language was right, but the rhythm was off. The way a person's voice is right, but the rhythm is off when they are composing themselves. The Accord would process it. That was what the Accord did. It would assign it to an available tribunal track, and the tribunal track would have a timeline, and the timeline would be somewhere between 9 and 11 years, which was the standard window for matters of this complexity. The ships were still there. Not doing anything, not threatening, not communicating, holding position at 11 Keth installations with engines at minimum thrust and weapons cold, the same way they had been holding for the 6 hours since the timestamp reached 0, which was also the same way they had been holding for 60 years before that, in the staging nodes, waiting. They were very good at waiting. 7 days after the arrival, Marin Vale submitted a formal request. She wrote it herself, which was unusual. Most delegation submissions of this kind went through the diplomatic staff. She wrote it at the terminal in the human delegation's quarters, in the same beige room with the same window looking out at Cauldron Prime, which was still turning and still indifferent and still lit from somewhere inside itself with that sourceless amber light. The request cited the provision governing status recategorization based on demonstrated capability. It was 2 pages. It was calm. It was procedurally complete. It was filed on an open Accord channel, logged and timestamped, publicly accessible. She read it through once before she sent it. Then she reached into her left breast pocket. The envelope had been there for 11 years. The flap was smooth from the same thumb, the same motion, the same habit she had not been able to explain to anyone because no one had asked, and she would not have known what to say if they had. She had received it the morning after a woman named Etta Calloway died, the colonial administrator, the engineer, the person who had built a settlement on a rim corridor that the Keth would eventually want and had also, quietly, over the course of 30 years, helped design the trigger beneath it. The envelope was addressed to no one. There was no name on the front. There was only the flap worn smooth. Vale opened it. Inside was a single card. On the card were 4 words, in Etta Calloway's handwriting, which Vale had seen once before, on the original Node 14 activation protocol, in the corner where the designer traditionally initialed their work. We already answered it. That was all. No date, no explanation, no instruction, just the 4 words in small careful letters from a woman who had been dead for 11 years and had apparently known, 30 years before that, what the question would eventually be. Vale sat with the card for a moment. Then she put it back in the envelope, put the envelope back in her pocket, sent the reclassification request, and went to stand at the window. At Iron Verdict, Veth-Droon held the original transmission in his hand. He had printed it. That was unusual for him. He processed most documents on screen, kept his desk clear, preferred the efficiency of digital records. He had printed this one because he had wanted to hold it, and he had held it for 7 days, and he was holding it now. 11 sets of coordinates, the number 72, nothing else. He had spent 7 days trying to find the right category for it. He had pulled every psychological maneuver file in the Dominion's operational library. He had reviewed every recorded case of a species using non-standard communication formats in a standoff scenario. He had read the Accord's full engagement doctrine archive, which went back 11,000 years and covered every format of threat, demand, ultimatum, warning, and declaration that any member species had ever used. The transmission was not in any of those categories, because it was not a threat. A threat assumed you might not know what was coming and wanted you afraid of the possibility. This transmission had told him exactly what was coming, and when and where, precisely, without ambiguity. It had given him 72 hours to prepare, to respond, to reposition, and he had spent those 72 hours filing it as a maneuver, because that was the category he had, because his category for humanity said client-tier noncombatant, and client-tier noncombatants did not send you the coordinates of your own installations with a countdown attached. No warning given, no quarter asked, no move made that was not already in the record. He had been wrong. Not about everything, not about most species, but about this one in this file at this moment, in the way that you are wrong when you file something once and trust the filing and never check it again. The transmission was a courtesy. That was the word he kept coming back to. They had told him where and when because they wanted him to know they had always had the right to choose otherwise, and had chosen to let him watch it coming. He understood now what the open Accord channel meant, what the lack of encryption meant, what it meant that every step, the activation order, the node confirmations, the transmission, the formation coordinates, was logged, time-stamped, and publicly accessible. Humanity had filed it. All of it. In the same format the Keth had been using for 400 years. He opened a response channel. The composition field was blank. It had been blank for 7 days. He had sat with it 3 times and closed it 3 times, and he sat with it now, and the blankness of it was not a technical problem or a formatting question. It was the correct response to a thing that had been done so completely, so precisely, so publicly and irreversibly, that there was nothing left to say to it that was not already in the record. No demand had been made. No demand would be made. The ships were there. They would stay there until they were not, and when they left it would be because humanity had decided they should leave, and that decision would also be filed, logged, and publicly accessible. He closed the composition field. He set the printed transmission on the corner of his desk, face up. He did not file it. In the Accord chamber, 6 hours after the session closed, Elder Ashadi sat alone. The resin had burned down. The smell of cedar and old copper was fading, replaced by the blended nothing smell of recycled air. Through the ceiling's clear alloy, the stars burned with the indifference they had maintained across 11,000 years of the Accord's recorded history. Through the first membership disputes and the last ones, through every vote and every tribunal and every notification filed by every expansion doctrine civilization that had ever learned to work within the procedural frameworks instead of against them. She had the Keth mediation request in her hands. She read it once more. Then she set it on the seat beside her, face down, and looked at the ceiling. She was not thinking about what she had said 3 days ago. She had said it and it was said, and that was done. She was not thinking about the vote, or the 88, or the 3 minutes she had been given, or whether any of it would have changed anything if the number had been different. She was thinking about Marin Vale's face. Not the face in the anteroom, the one she had described to herself as already knowing. The other face, the one she had seen for a fraction of a second when Drethavi finished reading the notification and the vote had been called. The face that had not moved, not because it was controlled, not because Vale was composed or disciplined or professionally still, because there was nothing to react to. The verdict had not surprised her. The tribunal timeline had not surprised her. None of it had been news, because the answer had been in place before the question had been asked, and Marin Vale had known that, and had sat in row 7 with that knowledge and a cup of coffee she did not drink, and had waited for the accord to finish processing its paperwork. What it must feel like, Ashadi thought, to be that patient, that right, that quiet for that long. She did not say it aloud. There was no one to say it to. She picked up the mediation request. She set it in the intake tray on her armrest, which routed to the clerk's office, which would assign it to a tribunal track, which would give it a timeline of 9 to 11 years. She burned the last of her resin. The smell of cedar and old copper rose and faded. The stars held.